Along the slow-moving Nile, where black silt gives life to the desert's edge, oppression had become the rhythm of Israel's days. The book of Exodus opens in an Egypt that no longer remembered Joseph. Generations had passed since Jacob's family sought refuge there, and a new dynasty ruled, a pharaoh, unnamed in the text, who feared that the Hebrews' growing numbers might one day threaten the state. He imposed forced labor, setting taskmasters over the to build the store cities of Pithom and Ramses, both attested as sites of royal construction in the eastern delta. When hardship failed to limit Israel's population, Pharaoh's decree turned ruthless. Every male Hebrew child was to be cast into the Nile. The Nile, source of fertility, thus became a weapon of policy. According to Exodus 2, a Levite woman, later named Jochebed, bore a son during this decree and hid him for 3 months. When concealment grew impossible, she placed him in a small basket of papyrus, sealed with bitumen and pitch. The Hebrew word teva, used here and only once before for Noah's Ark, suggests not a ship of direction, but a vessel of survival, a microcosm of divine preservation. Jochebed set the ark among the reeds at the river's edge, while the child's sister, Miriam, watched from afar. The scene that followed changed the current of history. Pharaoh's daughter came to bathe in the Nile, saw the basket and took pity on the crying infant. Recognizing him as a Hebrew, she nevertheless resolved to save him. Exodus gives no name for the princess, though later Jewish tradition calls her Bithia, meaning daughter of Yah. Whether that name is historical or symbolic, it captures the moral point. Compassion broke through decree. Miriam's quick courage shaped the outcome. She offered to find a Hebrew nurse, bringing the child's own mother back to nurse him under royal protection. Thus, by what could only be described as providential irony, the woman ordered to surrender her child was paid to raise him. When the boy grew, he was brought to Pharaoh's daughter, who named him Moses, Moshe, saying, "Because I drew him out of the water." The Egyptian root ms or mos, meaning born of or child of, as in names like Thutmose, supports the plausibility of this etymology. The Hebrew explanation is folk etymological but thematically precise. From that fragile ark arose a man shaped by 2 worlds. Raised within the royal household, Moses would have received the education typical of elite Egyptian youth: literacy in hieroglyphic and hieratic script, exposure to mathematics, medicine, and the theological notions of ma'at, order and justice. The biblical text does not describe his education, but Acts 7:22 later summarizes that Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, a phrase that likely preserves authentic cultural memory. He was also, however, nurtured during infancy by his Hebrew mother, who may have instilled the ancestral faith that the palace could neither erase nor fully understand. At some point, perhaps in early adulthood, this dual identity forced a reckoning. Exodus 2:11-12 recounts that Moses saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. Looking about and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The act is presented not as premeditated rebellion, but as spontaneous outrage at injustice. Yet, it revealed where his loyalties lay. The next day, when he tried to mediate between 2 Hebrews, they rejected his authority. "Who made you a ruler and a judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Word of the incident reached Pharaoh, and Moses fled eastward into the desert. This episode aligns broadly with Egyptian realities. The delta's proximity to Sinai made flight possible, and political refugees did escape eastward through the frontier forts. While no external Egyptian record mentions Moses by name, a silence not unexpected for a disgraced courtier or fugitive, the setting corresponds to known geography. Across the wilderness he journeyed to Midian, a region identified with northwest Arabia or the eastern Sinai. There, at a well, the meeting place of many biblical destinies, he defended the daughters of a local priest, later named Jethro, also called Ruel. The hospitality offered in return drew him into a new life. Jethro gave him Zipporah as wife, and Moses settled to shepherd flocks in the shadow of rugged mountains. His first son was named Gershom, for I have been a stranger in a foreign land. Years stretched quietly. The text compresses decades into a few verses, yet these were the formative years of reflection. The prince who once acted in anger learned the discipline of stillness. The man who had fled from judgment learned to listen for a higher summons. Shepherding in the arid lands around Horeb, Moses would have known every path, spring, and rock of that terrain, knowledge that later proved vital for leading a nation through it. Meanwhile, Exodus 2:23 states that the king of Egypt died, and the Israelites groaned under their bondage. The narrative's phrasing, God heard their groaning and remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, signals that divine history was about to re-enter human events. The transformation of Moses from fugitive to prophet would begin not in palaces or councils, but in solitude, before a bush that burned without being consumed. Section 2. The flight to Midian and the making of a prophet. The desert receives fugitives the way the sea receives a river, quietly, without questions. When Moses slipped beyond the cultivated edge of the Nile country and into the pale immensity of Sinai, he left behind a world of granite temples and measured hieroglyphs for a world that wrote in wind. His footprints, briefly impressed upon powdery ground, were the only records of a prince surrendering privilege for the sake of a conscience that refused to be silent. The deed that drove him there, the slaying of a brutal overseer, had exposed a fault line in his identity. If he remained in Egypt, he would be tried as an enemy of the state. If he vanished into the wilderness, he would be judged by a different tribunal: solitude. The biblical text compresses this transition into a few stark lines. When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. The simplicity conceals the peril. To move from the delta to the austerity of the peninsula meant skirting Egypt's eastern defences, a chain of watchposts and fortresses guarding the Way of Horus, the overland corridor to Canaan. Archaeology has illuminated how real that security belt was. New Kingdom forts, supply depots, and zigzagging walls once policed the frontier, a network so tangible that ovens, stores, and even petrified dough have turned up in recent excavations along the Horus Road. These finds don't retell Moses' individual route, but they do show that slipping away from Egypt required nerve, timing, and knowledge of the land's seams, where empire thinned into open sand. If the border could be avoided or outweighted, the land beyond widened into a labyrinth of wadis and basalt ridges, where the desert blooms only after rare rain. There the light is unfiltered, and the line between day and night feels like the closing and opening of an eye. In that clarity, Moses discovered another kind of schooling. He had been trained in the wisdom of Egypt, letters, numbers, statecraft, an education later tradition remembers in a compact line. Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. The remark survives in the speech of Stephen in Acts and likely preserves authentic memory of what royalty learned at court. The library of Moses' youth was a palace, the library of his exile was the horizon. Both would prove essential. He arrived in Midian, and the narrative places him, with deliberate symbolism, beside a well. In Scripture, wells are thresholds where lives are rerouted. Hagar's rescue, Isaac's betrothal, Jacob's meeting with Rachel. At this well, Moses encountered shepherds who were driving away a group of young women, daughters of a local priest. The fugitive intervened. He had not come to the desert to search for trouble, yet trouble had a way of revealing where his loyalties lived. The man who once defended a beaten slave now defended strangers who had no recourse but to retreat. The women returned home earlier than usual, and their father, named Reuel in this scene and later called Jethro, asked how. They told him of an Egyptian who delivered them and drew water for their flocks. The father's response is human and warm. "Where is he? Why did you leave the man? Call him, that he may eat bread." The text's dual naming of Moses' future father-in-law, Reuel. Here, Jethro afterward, has puzzled readers for centuries. Traditional Jewish explanations propose multiple names or titles for a single person. Modern scholars often suggest that Jethro functions as a title, his excellency, while Reuel is a given name. In any case, the story makes its point plainly. The foreigner found a household. Hospitality turned into belonging. Moses was welcomed, and in time he married Zipporah, one of Reuel Jethro's daughters. Their firstborn he named Gershom, saying, "I have been a stranger in a foreign land." The name is a sentence compressed into 2 syllables: Jer, sojourner, stranger, and Sham, there. A confession that exile is not just about geography, but about the ache of not belonging even when a table is set before you. The name signals more than melancholy. It signals honesty about where he stood in the story of his own life. Where exactly was Midian? The Bible's geography points east of the Gulf of Aqaba, in the northwestern span of Arabia, lands of flinty uplands, caravan tracks and oases threaded like beads. Standard reference works describe Midian as a nomadic confederation inhabiting that region, often interacting with the Israelites from the Exodus through the era of the Judges. That placement aligns with the way Exodus depicts Moses moving among Midianite pastures and later circling back toward Egypt from the southeast. While some modern proposals argue for a Midian that includes parts of southern Jordan or the eastern Sinai, the broader consensus holds that biblical Midian lay along the eastern shorelines of the Gulf of Aqaba. This helps explain the texture of Moses' new life: pastoral, seasonal, and set amid the trade and tribal politics of northwest Arabia. Yet even with a map, you cannot measure what exile measures. In Egypt, Moses had a name that sounded half Egyptian, Moshe, long understood by scholars to echo the Egyptian mes element found in royal names like Thutmose or Ramesses, born of a deity. Exodus preserves a Hebrew wordplay, "because I drew him out of the water," that speaks to meaning rather than philology. Strictly speaking, the Hebrew form for drawn out one would be different. The narrative turns the name into vocation. The one drawn out will one day draw others out. That interpretive turn is theologically intentional, even if the etymology points back toward Egypt. In Midian, the prince with tutors became the man with a staff. He learned, as shepherds learn, the slow grammar of the land, where acacia throws its brief shade at noon, which gullies hold water 2 days longer after rain, how the stars tilt the night and can be read like script. The flock taught him patience because sheep do not care about a leader's pedigree. They follow only those who will face jackals first and go last through narrow ways. When a lamb strayed into thorn, he discovered that gentleness and stubbornness are not opposites. Leadership in palaces is a performance, leadership in pastures is proof. This season is easy to romanticize, but the wilderness demands more than poetry. A shepherd's life meant bruises, sleepless nights, and exposure. The extremes recalibrate a person: day heat that pushes the air into a white hush, night cold that makes one grateful for a small fire, the constant arithmetic of water, distance, and risk. That arithmetic would become the logistics of an exodus. Even before a divine call, Moses was being schooled in the ordinary logistics of survival, the very skills required to move large groups across hostile ground. Meanwhile, Egypt continued, indifferent to the exile of one man. The king of Egypt died, Exodus notes, dynastic change rumbling like distant thunder, and the Israelites groaned under their bondage and cried out. Their cry is not merely sound, it is covenant language, the remembered promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, rising like heat from sun-struck stone. The text says God heard, remembered, saw, and knew. The verbs pile up as if in answer to the long silence that follows oppression. The divine regard returns to the foreground of history. Moses does not yet know this. In Midian, he is busy with water skins and lambing season. The household into which he married was not ordinary. Jethro, priest of Midian, stood at a cultural crossroads where ancestral devotion, clan law, and desert ritual intertwined. Later narratives will show him wise in the arts of governance, able to read people and systems with calm clarity. For now, he is the man who gave shelter to a stranger, and, in doing so, set the stage for counsel that would steady an entire nation. Nothing in Exodus suggests that Jethro's priesthood was idolatrous or hostile. Later traditions discuss his faith with varying emphases, but the narrative itself treats him as a God-fearing ally whose advice Moses will welcome. The texture of Midianite religion is debated. Polytheistic strands surely existed in the region, but Jethro's figure emerges in Scripture as a morally serious worshipper who recognizes the God who delivers Israel. This portrait becomes explicit after the Exodus, when he blesses the Lord and offers sacrifices in gratitude. Years pass. Their number is not given, only their effect. Moses names a second son, Eleazar. My God is help. Another small testimony to the way exile can be endured when gratitude resurfaces like an unexpected spring. His days acquire a cadence: dawn watch, pasture, midday rest in a thin angle of shade, evening count at the fold. Beyond the domestic circle, desert politics simmer, the barter of salt and leather, caravans clipping past toward the copper mines of the Arabah, where distinctive Midianite pottery has turned up in abundance, a reminder that these tribes moved in patterns broader than any one campfire. In such a setting, news travelled. Traders in frankincense and bitumen carried stories with their wares, rumours of construction in the delta, of a pharaoh's death, of uprisings and pacifications. Moses likely heard fragments, each like a spark that dies before it can become a flame. He had made peace with being far away, and that peace, though real, can numb vocation. There is a way the desert has of preparing a person without announcing it. The text says that Moses led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. That detail begins the next movement of his life and belongs to the following section in our narrative. For now, it is enough to notice his habit of taking the flock farther than usual, pushing into ranges where the rock is burnt umber and the sky feels close enough to bruise. Horeb and Sinai alternate as names in the Bible. Some traditions prefer one, some the other, and the location of the mountain remains an old, lively debate. Many scholars place Midian east of the Gulf of Aqaba in northwest Arabia. From that vantage, proposals have risen that the mountain of God also lay in that territory. Others argue strongly that Sinai was within the peninsula west of the Gulf, and that not every Midianite campsite defines Midian's whole territory. What we can say with confidence is that Moses' shepherding brought him into the orbit of a specific highland revered enough to be described as God's mountain, a place to which the story will return like a homing bird. If flight is a rupture, Midian is a repair. The desert did not erase Moses' Egyptian schooling, it completed it. His earlier life offered access to power, administrative sense, and the vocabulary of kings. His exile offered patience, moral clarity, and the craft of surviving with others in unforgiving landscapes. The first made him formidable, the second made him useful. The first taught him how to speak to rulers, the second would teach him how to speak to the tired, the thirsty, the ordinary. Together they would teach him to speak to God. The name Moses itself keeps humming under the surface of these years. Scholars point out that Moshe in Hebrew reads as an active participle, one who draws out, even though Pharaoh's daughter's explanation fits a passive sense. The biblical storyteller appears to prefer meaning over linguistic precision, bending the name toward vocation. This could imply a subtle signal of destiny. The boy drawn out of peril will grow into the man who draws a people through peril. Grammarians can note the mismatch. Theologians will note the aim. Both observations stand, and together they reveal how Scripture often arranges language to serve narrative purpose without losing contact with historical texture. There were temptations available to Moses in Midian. He might have allowed the ache of Gershom's name to harden into resignation. He might have decided that saving one household from rough shepherds was enough heroism for a lifetime. He might have built a quiet state and let Egypt's memory bleach out like bones in sunlight. But the story resists that ending. The verbs in Egypt, heard, remembered, saw, knew, pull like a tide. If God is moving the world toward a reckoning with injustice, the exile's ordinary days are not wasted. They are rehearsal. The man who once acted in haste is being refitted to act on command. What precisely did he learn in those long months between lambing seasons? Based on what we know about pastoral life in northwest Arabia, we can assume he learned the unwritten map of cisterns and springs, practiced the discipline of rationing water among creatures that cannot make sense of scarcity, and mastered the art of keeping large numbers together when the terrain keeps trying to scatter them. He would have learned which wadis flash flood with sudden rain and which open plateaus are magnets for sandstorms. He would have learned to read the night sky, Caravans do not move safely without that literacy. None of this is romantic. All of it is pastoral science, and later it will keep people alive. He also learned how to take counsel. By temperament he had acted alone, striking an oppressor, separating quarrelling slaves. But shepherding is communal. Flocks mingle, disputes arise over grazing rights, and elders convene in the shade to barter solutions. Landscape law that depends more on wisdom than on force. In that setting, a younger man watches older men read faces and words, settling hot tempers with hand-sized phrases. It is not difficult to imagine that Jethro, whose measured advice will shape Israel's court system after the Exodus, quietly modelled this kind of leadership long before he spoke it aloud. Beneath the domestic joy and the new responsibilities, a homesickness remained, the shapeless sorrow of having a people somewhere else. Moses had become a husband and father, roles he embraced. He had become, too, a kind of third thing, not Egyptian, not Midianite, but a steward of a memory that wouldn't dissolve. Some memories are like that. They refuse to reduce themselves to nostalgia. They insist on becoming responsibilities. In time, the shepherd will turn aside to see a flame that does not consume, and a voice will give shape to that responsibility with a name that has no equal. But before the fire, there had to be these years, the quiet practice of fidelity without an audience, the lowering of a proud man into the humility that can hear. If Egypt taught him how to speak, Midian taught him how to listen. The man who will stand between a despot and a nation first stood between a watering trough and ordinary injustice. The staff in his hand is still a shepherd's tool, but soon it will become an instrument of signs. The horizon he studies for weather will soon bloom with pillars, cloud by day, fire by night. The lamb he shoulders will become a metaphor for a people. When the story pauses here, it does so not because nothing is happening, but because the essential thing is nearly ready to happen. The cry from Egypt has reached the ear of the one who remembers promises. Moses, for his part, has reached the far side of the wilderness. The two movements, divine remembrance and human readiness, are about to converge at a place where a thorn bush of all things throws light sufficient to re-illuminate history. Section 3. The Burning Bush and the Call of God. Dawn in the high country does not so much arrive as ignite. Rock faces go from iron to bronze to a white gold that forces the eyes to water. On such a morning, Moses drove Jethro's flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. The text's simplicity hides how remote this pasture was. Shepherds do not push animals into country they don't already know can keep them alive. Yet, on that day the route bent toward a ridge where a thorny shrub shimmered with flame and somehow did not burn away. Exodus 3:1-2. The narrative is spare. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. Moses did what any shepherd with a curious mind and a cautious heart would do. He said, "I will turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burned." Then a voice called his name, twice as if to steady a man whose world was tipping, "Moses, Moses." The response was as brief as a heartbeat. "Here I am." Exodus 3:2-4. Before calling him forward, God set the grammar of approach. Do not come near. Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. In the ancient Near East, removing footwear signified reverence and a refusal to bring ordinary dust into a consecrated space. Sources across Jewish and comparative literature reflect this symbolism. Scripture itself repeats the command when the commander of the Lord's army addresses Joshua, Joshua 5:15. The act marks a boundary, soil that is now more than soil, a presence that transforms place, Exodus 3:5. Then came identification. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. The formula anchors what follows in covenant memory. This is not a new deity, but the one who had pledged himself to Moses' ancestors. The shepherd hid his face. Fear before the holy is not a defect of courage, but the beginning of wisdom, Exodus 3:6. I have seen, I have heard, I know. What God said next is the hinge of the Exodus story. I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them. The piling up of verbs, seen, heard, known, come down, signals a decisive intervention. Deliverance has a direction, out of Egypt toward a land described with ancestral borders and familiar peoples, Exodus 3:7-9, and then the shock. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh that you may bring my people out of Egypt. Moses' recoil is immediate and human. Who am I that I should go? The answer does not flatter Moses, it centers God. I will be with you. When you have brought the people out, you shall serve God on this mountain. The sign is curious, worship after the fact. It teaches Moses to walk on promise before confirmation. It promises that the circle will close where it began, at Horeb, Exodus 3:10-12. What is his name? Moses anticipates a question the elders will ask. What is the name of the one who sends you? The reply is among Scripture's most discussed lines, Ehyeh, Asher Ehyeh. The Hebrew can mean, I am who I am, I will be who I will be, or, as many scholars observe, the phrase blends being with faithful presence. God then gives the form Moses is to speak publicly. Say to the Israelites, Ehyeh has sent me to you. Yahweh, the God of your fathers, this is my name forever. In short, the one who simply is, and will be reliably present, sends you. Exodus 3:13-15. For the text and translation notes, see Safaria's rendering of Exodus 3:14, and for a concise overview of the Tetragrammaton, YHWH, as the divine name revealed to Moses, Britannica's entry is serviceable. Many scholars stress that Ehyeh, I am, I will be, is first person, while YHWH is third person, he is, he will be, linking the self-declaration to the covenant name used thereafter. This could imply, without settling the philology, that the name is not an abstract label but a promise of presence. The God who is will be with Israel. That reading fits the next instruction. Moses is to gather the elders with a specific message. Yahweh, the God of your fathers, has appeared to me, and I have observed what has been done to you in Egypt. He is to ask Pharaoh for a 3-day journey to sacrifice in the wilderness, and he is warned in advance that Pharaoh will refuse until compelled by a mighty hand. The call begins with realism, not romance. Exodus 3:16-22. Reluctance and the 3 signs. Even with a name to speak and a promise to carry, Moses voices another fear. They will not believe me or listen to my voice. God answers with 3 signs. First, the staff becomes a snake, and then a staff again when seized by the tail. Second, Moses' hand becomes leprous like snow and is restored. Third, water from the Nile will become blood on the dry ground. Exodus 4:1-9. These are not party tricks. They target both credibility before Israel and, soon, Egypt's religious and ecological heart. The Nile is Egypt's life. Turning its water to blood will be a stroke against the very artery of empire. Text Bible Gateway's NIV Geneva parallel. Notably, serpents have deep resonance in Egyptian symbolism, from protective uraei on royal crowns to ritual and mythic associations. That background, while not demanded by the Exodus text, helps explain the drama of a staff becoming a living serpent and then being grasped without harm. Egyptian iconography often depicts serpent staffs, and priestly literature mentions serpent lore. Based on what we know of such symbols, we can assume the sign carried a pointed message. The God who sends Moses is sovereign over powers Egypt imagines it controls. Moses then raises a personal obstacle. I am not a man of words. I am slow of speech and of tongue. The response pierces to the core. Who has made man's mouth? I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall speak. Still Moses pleads for someone else. Divine patience thins, and God appoints Aaron, already on the way to meet him, as spokesman. The arrangement is clear. Moses will speak to Aaron, Aaron to the people. God will be with your mouth and with his mouth. The charge concludes, and take in your hand this staff with which you shall do the signs. Exodus 4:10-17. Back to Midian, back toward Egypt. The call accepted, Moses returns to Jethro and asks leave to visit his family in Egypt. Jethro releases him with blessing. God confirms, "Those who sought your life are dead." Moses sets his wife Zipporah and sons on a donkey, takes the staff of God, and begins the long journey back. Exodus 4:18-20. Then comes one of the Bible's strangest passages, told in 3 compact verses that feel like lightning. At a lodging place on the way, the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. Then Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and caused to touch his feet with it and said, "Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me." So he let him alone. The text explains only that the phrase concerned circumcision, Exodus 4:24-6. Scholarly interpretations vary. Some propose Moses had failed to circumcise his son in line with the Abrahamic covenant, and the near-fatal encounter dramatized the urgency of covenant obedience for the very man sent to lead a covenant people. Others note that feet can be a euphemism in Hebrew, and debate precisely whom Zipporah touched, the child, Moses, or even the divine messenger. What is clear is the result: blood rite performed, mortal danger past. For readers who want a careful review of the interpretive landscape, see S.D. Kunin's Structural Analysis, 1996, and later treatments that survey rabbinic readings, Talbot 2017, and Exegetical Arguments. Accessible summaries are also available in reputable lay outlets. This could imply that the call narrative is framed by holiness and covenant markers, sandals off before the flame, blood shed at the wayside. Moses is being fitted not only with signs for Pharaoh, but with the sign of belonging. The messenger who spared him after circumcision is the same presence who told him to tread softly on holy ground. Horeb and Sinai, one mountain, 2 names. Readers sometimes ask, is Horeb the same as Sinai? The Bible uses both names. Many scholars treat them as 2 designations for the same sacred complex, perhaps Horeb for the broader region and Sinai for the peak, or the reverse. Others see the difference as stemming from distinct traditions later woven together. Any of these explanations are reasonable within the range of academic discussion. Either way, the narrative coherence stands. The mountain of God to which Moses will bring the people is the very place where the fire first spoke. See accessible discussions by Imes and by Bill Mounts that summarize the options. Go, gather the elders. Before Moses reaches Egypt, the plan is already sketched. He and Aaron will gather the elders of Israel, communicate the name and the promise, and then confront Pharaoh with a modest-sounding request that encodes a larger claim: 3 days into the wilderness to sacrifice. In Exodus, that request functions as a test of sovereignty. Whose voice sets the calendar of a people? God foretells Pharaoh's refusal and the necessity of a mighty hand. The text also anticipates that the Egyptians will ultimately show favor, foreshadowing reparations in the form of silver, gold, and garments. Exodus 3:16-22, 4:27-1. The staff becomes vocation. When Moses first asked, "Who am I?" the answer he received redirected the question, "Who is with you?" As the conversation at the bush continues, the staff in his hand takes on symbolic charge, the staff of God. In later scenes, it will stretch over the Nile, over the sky, over the sea. Here, it stands as a tangible reminder that ordinary tools can become sacramental instruments when pressed into the service of a calling. The biblical writer never lets us forget that it is God's power, not Moses' cleverness, that does the work, yet the narrative equally refuses to erase human agency. Moses must go, speak, lift, act. Aaron must relay words. The elders must listen. Pharaoh must choose. The call does not crush the person, it requisitions the person. What the name means for enslaved people, scholars continue to debate the exact grammar of Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. Some emphasize, "I am who I am," others, "I will be who I will be." In either case, the function of the name in context is plain: assurance of presence for a people whose daily experience was absence, absent rest, absent justice, absent dignity. Britannica's overview of YHWH notes that the 4-letter name, the Tetragrammaton, represents the God revealed in Exodus. Many biblical scholars also point out that Exodus 3 correlates the first-person self-declaration, Ehyeh, with the covenant name Israel will speak, third person YHWH. That connection, together with the repeated promise, I will be with you, strongly supports the pastoral reading that the name exposes God's character as present, faithful and free, not bound to shrines or empires. This could imply something more, not simply that God exists, but that he will actively be with Israel in exactly the ways the mission requires, guiding, judging, sustaining, so that enslaved people can reinterpret their days by a new grammar. The narrative then unfolds as a long demonstration of that name in action. A note on place and memory. Where exactly is Horeb, Sinai? The Bible does not pin the coordinates. Proposals span the southern Sinai Peninsula to sites east of the Gulf of Aqaba in northwest Arabia, where Midianite material culture is densely attested. On this question, responsible scholarship keeps multiple hypotheses open. What matters literally is the return. Worship on this mountain will be the sign that Moses was truly sent. The point is theological before it is cartographical. The shepherd will lead a nation back to the place where he learned that holy ground can hide inside ordinary ground until God speaks. The road reopens. After the lodging place crisis, the narrative gathers speed. Aaron meets Moses at the mountain of God, and the brothers embrace. In Egypt, they convene the elders, report the name, and perform the signs. The people believe, they bowed their heads and worshipped. Exodus 4-71. The call is no longer private fire, but public proclamation. A confrontation with Pharaoh is inevitable, and the text sets the theological stakes bluntly. Pharaoh has a name and claims sovereignty. YHWH has a name and claims a people. The story that follows will answer one question. Whose word rules the world of these slaves? Section 4. Return to Egypt and confrontation with Pharaoh. The desert wind had scarcely settled the dust of Moses' journey when obedience began to test its own weight. He had seen the fire that burned without consuming. He had heard the name that exists without rival. But revelation is easier to witness than to carry. The call that once sounded glorious now demanded travel, conversation, and risk. The God of his ancestors had sent him back into the land he once fled, not as a fugitive, but as an envoy, a shepherd returning to challenge a king. Moses rose early, gathered his wife Zipporah and their sons, and began the long trek north and west toward Egypt. The staff of God, once a shepherd's rod, was in his hand. Every step retraced the line of his exile in reverse, turning pastures into purpose. The road that had meant safety now led toward danger. Scripture records no dramatized farewell with Jethro, only a blessing. Go in peace. The calm of that blessing would echo later when the man who had tended flocks would stand before armies. Along the journey, Moses received a quiet assurance. All the men who sought your life are dead. The danger that once chased him had passed, but a deeper trial waited, the collision of two claims to sovereignty. The confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh was not merely a political struggle. It was theological in its depth. In Egypt, the ruler was a living embodiment of divine order, the human face of the god Horus. For a former prince to stand before the throne and declare that another lord demanded obedience was to strike at the ideological core of empire. When Moses approached the frontier of Egypt, his brother Aaron was already on the road to meet him. The narrative does not explain how Aaron knew where to find him. It simply says that God had instructed him to go into the wilderness. The reunion at the mountain of God is told in brief but the tender lines. The brothers embraced, and Moses recounted all that had happened: the voice, the fire, the name, the mission. Together they returned to Egypt and gathered the elders of Israel. Aaron spoke the words the Lord had given, and Moses showed the signs. The people believed. Their faith expressed itself in worship. They bowed their heads and blessed the name they had not heard in generations. That early success might have seemed to confirm that the task would unfold easily. But faith without conflict is rarely durable. The first audience to the message was the oppressed, who found hope. The second would be the oppressor, who would find offense. When Moses and Aaron entered Pharaoh's presence, they came not as insurgents but as messengers. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, "Let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness." The response was scorn. Pharaoh's question remains one of history's most defining challenges to faith. Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover I will not let Israel go. To an Egyptian monarch, the word Lord, rendering the covenant name Yahweh, was the name of a tribal god of slaves. Empires are slow to believe that the prayers of brickmakers can outweigh the decrees of palaces. Moses and Aaron clarified. They asked only for a 3-day journey into the desert to sacrifice to their God, lest they be struck with pestilence or sword. Pharaoh's refusal came with a sharp counter-accusation: idleness. Why do you make the people rest from their work? His solution was cruelty disguised as policy. He commanded his overseers to withhold straw for brickmaking, yet require the same daily quota. Straw bound the clay, strengthening the bricks. Without it, production slowed, and whips cracked harder. The effect was immediate. The people's labor became impossible, their spirits broke, and resentment turned on Moses. "May the Lord judge you," they cried, "for you have made us a stench in Pharaoh's sight." The liberator became the scapegoat. Moses returned to God in despair. "Why have you sent me? Since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done evil to this people, and you have not delivered them at all." The divine reply was both reassurance and redefinition. "Now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh, for with a strong hand he will let them go, and with a strong hand he will drive them out." The emphasis shifted from Moses' timing to divine certainty. Liberation would not be a negotiation, but an act of power. At this point, the text pauses for a genealogical listing of the tribes, anchoring Moses and Aaron firmly in the tribe of Levi. This insertion functions as both authentication and reminder. These are not mythic figures, but sons of a lineage whose covenant reaches back to Abraham. The next scenes unfold like thunder rolling closer, each plague another strike against the illusions of divine kingship. Before the first plague, a sign was demanded. Pharaoh asked for proof of authority. Aaron cast down the staff before him, and it became a serpent. The royal magicians replicated the sign by their arts, but Aaron's serpent swallowed theirs. It was a brief contest of symbols, a rehearsal for the coming storm. What Pharaoh dismissed as tricks would soon escalate into cosmic upheaval. The sequence of the plagues. The plagues that followed came in measured escalation, each one aimed at Egypt's physical and spiritual infrastructure. Scholars and theologians alike note that the series exposes the fragility of a system that claimed divine permanence. Whether understood as supernatural events or divinely timed natural catastrophes, the plagues are arranged with literary precision. The Nile to blood. The river that nourished Egypt turned crimson, and fish died in its depths. The priests of the Nile could offer no purification. The magicians could mimic the sign but not reverse it. For 7 days the water stank of death, and the people dug around the banks for drinkable moisture. The god of the river, Hapi, was powerless. Frogs. Amphibians poured from the river into homes and beds, an invasion both absurd and terrifying. When Pharaoh begged for relief, Moses prayed, and the frogs died in heaps. Yet once the pressure eased, Pharaoh's heart hardened again. Gnats or lice. Dust became a swarm of tiny stinging insects. The magicians could not reproduce it and admitted, "This is the finger of God." Pharaoh remained unmoved. Flies. Clouds of insects filled the air but spared the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived. For the first time, distinction appeared between Egypt and Israel. Pestilence on livestock. Horses, donkeys, camels, and cattle died in the fields. Economic ruin began to spread. Boils. Soot thrown into the air became dust that clung to skin and festered into sores. Even the magicians could not stand before Moses. Hail. A storm of fire and ice ravaged the land, destroying crops and breaking trees. Pharaoh acknowledged sin briefly, promising to release the people, but retracted when the skies cleared. Locusts. A devouring wind brought insects that consumed every green thing left by the hail. Pharaoh's advisors warned him, "Egypt is ruined." Again he wavered, again he refused. Darkness. A thick obscurity fell over Egypt for 3 days, a darkness described as tangible. Yet the dwellings of Israel remained lit. Some interpreters see this as a symbolic blow against Ra, the sun god, the empire's supreme deity, death of the firstborn. The final plague stands apart in severity and solemnity. Every firstborn in Egypt died in one night, from the firstborn of Pharaoh to the captive in the dungeon. Yet in the houses of Israel, the destroyer passed over, the Passover and the night of departure. Before the last plague, God gave Moses instructions that transformed disaster into covenant. Each household was to sacrifice a lamb without blemish, apply its blood to the doorposts, and eat the meat roasted with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. The blood would be a sign that the destroyer should pass over those homes. The ritual was to be remembered annually as Passover, a feast of deliverance and identity. This night, poised between slavery and freedom, reshaped history. While Egyptian households mourned, the Israelites gathered their belongings, the dough of their bread still unleavened, and departed under a sky red with dawn. The Egyptian people, eager to be rid of them, gave silver, gold, and clothing, voluntary spoils that reversed centuries of unpaid labor. The text remarks that about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children, journeyed from Ramses to Succoth. Whether that number is literal or symbolic of a vast multitude, the scale represents the birth of a nation. Pharaoh, at last, ordered their departure. Yet even in surrender he could not let go of control. As the Hebrews moved eastward, pillars of cloud by day and fire by night guided them, a visible assurance of divine presence. They reached the edge of the sea, its waters stretching impassably before them, mountains on either side, and Egypt's chariots racing behind. The people cried out in terror, accusing Moses of leading them to their deaths. His answer, calm yet thunderous, became a refrain of faith. Fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord. The crossing of the sea, Moses lifted his staff and the waters parted. The text describes a strong east wind driving the sea back all night, creating a path of dry land between walls of water. The Israelites crossed, the Egyptian army pursued. At dawn, the sea returned to its strength, and the chariots were engulfed. The waters closed over the empire's pride, and on the far shore a freed people stood, astonished by silence. Some readers through the centuries have sought natural explanations, tidal shifts, wind set-downs, shallow marsh crossings. Others hold to a direct miraculous act. Both views agree on the theological message, that deliverance came not by military might but by divine intervention. The narrative's power lies in its pattern. The very element that threatened to drown the Hebrews became the medium of their salvation. On that shore, Moses and the people sang. The Song of the Sea is one of the oldest poems in Scripture, a hymn of triumph and awe. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea. It names God not as an abstract force, but as a warrior who defends the oppressed. The imagery is fierce. Chariots sinking like stone, waters piled up like walls, enemies swallowed like lead, but its climax turns prophetic. The Lord will reign forever and ever. The song closes the first act of Exodus with a vision not of escape but of enthronement. The one who defeats Pharaoh becomes the acknowledged king. Reflections on the conflict. Historically, scholars have long debated whether the plagues correspond to known ecological events or carry primarily symbolic meaning. It is reasonable to understand them as both, natural phenomena intensified or timed by divine will to expose the impotence of Egypt's gods. What matters in the narrative is not mechanism but message. Each act dismantles a layer of false certainty, first the river, then the land, then the sky, and finally the very continuity of life itself. The progression also shapes the psychology of Pharaoh. The text repeatedly states that his heart was hardened, sometimes by himself, sometimes by God. The pattern suggests a deepening entrapment. The more he resists, the less freedom remains. Pharaoh's autonomy collapses under the weight of his own pride. Theologically, this portrays the irony of tyranny. The ruler who enslaves others becomes enslaved to his own obstinacy. Meanwhile, the Israelites are also undergoing transformation. Their journey from despair to deliverance is not only physical, but moral. At first, they cannot trust the promise. They complain, blame, and falter. Yet through signs and judgments they learn that their God is not an idea, but an actor in history. The covenant becomes experiential. The aftermath. With the Red Sea behind them, Egypt receded into mythic memory. The land of bondage turned into a symbol of all that opposes freedom. But the confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh left enduring questions about power, obedience, and identity. Egypt's empire was mighty, yet it proved fragile when confronted by moral demand. The Hebrews were powerless, yet their faith turned weakness into endurance. Later generations would recall this contest whenever oppression returned in new forms. Prophets, poets, and reformers would all reach back to the phrase, "Let my people go." The words that once echoed in a royal court would become the anthem of countless struggles for liberation. In the immediate aftermath, however, the newly freed people faced a wilderness vast and uncertain. Their chains were broken, but their habits of fear remained. Moses, standing on the far shore, must have felt the weight of what lay ahead. He had challenged Pharaoh and prevailed, yet the harder task, transforming a multitude of ex-slaves into a covenant people, was just beginning. The closing image of this section is not the drowned army, but the open horizon. The sea has closed, but the path forward lies wide. The man who once questioned his own worth now leads a nation through silence lit by pillars of flame. Behind him, the waters shimmer with the memory of judgment. Before him, the desert stretches toward a mountain where the same voice will speak again, not from a bush this time, but from fire that crowns an entire peak. Section 5, the Exodus, Liberation, and the First Passover. The night that changed the world began in silence. Egyptian streets, once alive with the sound of slaves at labor and soldiers on patrol, were still. In the homes of the Hebrews, oil lamps burned low, their glow flickering on the rough mud brick walls. Each household had done exactly as commanded, chosen a year-old lamb without blemish, slain it at twilight, and brushed its blood upon the doorposts and lintel. The scent of roasted meat filled the narrow lanes of Goshen. For the first time in centuries, these people were not waiting for commands from overseers, but for the signal of God. They ate in haste, belt fastened, sandals on, staff in hand, as if the table itself were a doorway. The meal was not comfort but readiness: unleavened bread, bitter herbs, and the flesh of the lamb. Every detail bore meaning. The bitter herbs recalled slavery's sting. The unleavened bread anticipated a journey too urgent for waiting. The blood across the door was the mark of divine recognition. "When I see the blood," God had said, "I will pass over you, and no plague shall befall you to destroy you." That phrase, Passover, would name both the night and the nation's identity. In Egyptian households, death moved like an invisible tide. From the firstborn of Pharaoh to the firstborn of the prisoner, there was no house without loss. The cries of grief rose through the city, as if the land itself mourned. The Hebrews, meanwhile, waited in their marked dwellings, listening to a wind of judgment they could not see. Before dawn, a command spread through Egypt: "Rise, go out from among my people, both you and the Israelites. Be gone, and bless me also." Pharaoh's defiance collapsed into pleading. The same ruler who had once demanded endless labor now begged for departure. Egypt's wealth poured toward the departing slaves. Neighbors pressed silver and gold into their hands. It was not theft, as some would later claim, but a moral settling of debts, the wages of centuries compressed into one morning's exchange. The people left in organized haste. Generations had been born and buried in Egypt, yet the exodus itself happened within hours. They carried their kneading bowls bound in cloth on their shoulders, their children walking or riding beasts of burden, flocks trailing behind. They left Ramesses for Succoth, then Etham, traveling in tribes but united by one astonishment: they were free. Freedom, however, came with confusion. The route they took was not the direct northern road along the coast, the military highway known as the Way of the Philistines. God led them instead through the wilderness toward the Red Sea, for, as the text says, He did not lead them by the way of the Philistines, though that was near, lest the people repent when they see war. It was a strategic mercy. The newly liberated were not yet soldiers. Their bodies had left Egypt, but their minds were still trained by captivity. By day, a pillar of cloud went before them, shading the desert and marking the route. By night, a pillar of fire glowed at their head. These twin signs, the same divine presence made visible, offered direction when landmarks vanished and courage when fear crept back. The people could not have known it, but the wilderness would be both their classroom and their crucible. They soon came to the edge of the sea. Behind them, Pharaoh's heart hardened once more. The realization that an entire labor force had vanished stung like loss of blood. He ordered his chariots, 600 of the finest and countless others, to pursue. The ground trembled beneath the wheels as Egypt's army closed the distance. From the camp by the sea, the Israelites saw the dust rising and despaired. Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? The sarcasm in their words was born of terror. Moses stood before them with the calm of one who had already faced Pharaoh's wrath and God's fire. "Fear not," he said. "Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will show you today. The Egyptians whom you see today, you shall see no more forever." He stretched out his hand, and the wind began. Through the night, a strong east wind blew, driving back the waters until a path of dry land appeared. The people crossed between walls of water. The sea's roar muffled into distance. They moved quickly, torches flickering, children clutching their mothers' skirts, priests carrying the bones of Joseph. On the far side, they turned to see Pharaoh's chariots rushing into the same corridor. The wheels stuck, panic spread, the waters returned. By morning the sea was again calm, but its shores were strewn with wreckage. The might of Egypt had dissolved in the element it once worshipped. The story that had begun in a mother's small ark of reeds now ended with a nation crossing the water. The parallel was deliberate. The same God who drew one child from the Nile had drawn his entire people from bondage. The crossing of the sea was not only escape, it was rebirth. Egypt was the womb of suffering, the sea, the threshold of new creation. On the opposite shore, sunlight struck the wet sand, and Moses led the people in song. "I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea." The rhythm rose like a chant of warriors, yet sounded like the breath of the freed. Women took tambourines and danced. Among them, Miriam, Moses' sister, led a chorus, "Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously." In that moment, praise replaced complaint, and memory became liturgy. Later generations would call this song the oldest hymn of Israel, a poem of liberation older than any law or institution. Its words were raw with victory, yet already prophetic. "The Lord shall reign forever and ever," it declared, an assertion that turned theology into politics. The king of Egypt had drowned, but the kingship of God had risen. Yet the exodus was not complete in a single night. Physical flight was immediate, spiritual freedom would take decades. The people who had watched empires crumble before their eyes would soon tremble at thirst and hunger. But for now, the narrative pauses in triumph. The Passover, established that night, became the hinge between history and ritual. Every future generation was commanded to observe it, to eat the same meal, to tell the same story, and to remember that they themselves had been brought out of Egypt. The ritual preserved the intimacy of the event. A parent would say, "It is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. Not for them, but for me." Memory was meant to be participatory, not archival. The laws that followed bound remembrance to gratitude. The firstborn of every womb, human and animal, belonged to God, redeemed or sacrificed as acknowledgement that life itself was his gift. Even the calendar changed. "This month shall be for you the beginning of months." Time itself restarted with deliverance. The theological weight of Passover is immense. It binds sacrifice, substitution, and deliverance into a single night's drama. The lamb's blood, brushed on the doorpost, stood between death and life. The ancient world understood blood as life itself. To mark one's threshold with it was to declare belonging to the author of life. The angel of death, passing over those homes, enacted a judgment that distinguished not by ethnicity or strength, but by obedience to a divine sign. Over centuries the festival grew in depth. Later prophets and poets would see in it the pattern of all redemption: bondage confronted by power, blood exchanged for mercy, and journey begun by faith. Passover became the heartbeat of Jewish memory and the prototype of liberation itself. From an historical perspective, the Exodus marked the first great rupture in imperial order recorded by Hebrew tradition. It turned slaves into a people and suffering into a story of divine faithfulness. Whatever questions remain about dating or geography, the meaning endures unchanged, that no power built on oppression stands forever, and that the cry of the afflicted reaches the ears of heaven. Moses' leadership through this night revealed qualities that had matured since the days of the burning bush. Once hesitant, he now spoke with clarity and confidence, a man whose faith had become his command structure. His authority was not derived from title or weapon, but from obedience to a purpose larger than himself. Pharaoh had ruled by fear, Moses led by faith. As dawn brightened over the wilderness, the first steps of a nation imprinted the wet sand. The air smelled of salt and freedom. Behind them lay the ruins of empire. Before them lay uncertainty and promise. The journey would not be easy, but for the first time they walked under open sky, their faces turned toward a mountain where a covenant waited. The Exodus, though complete in geography, had only begun in spirit. The people who had watched waters divide and close would soon murmur for bread and water, forgetting the miracles that freed them. Yet the memory of this night, the blood, the song, the sea, would remain the touchstone of every future act of faith. When prophets would later rebuke kings, they would begin with a single reminder: I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Deliverance was not merely an event, it was identity. Section 6. The Wilderness Journey, Trials, Manna and Covenant, 2,300 words, accuracy verified and speculative areas clearly marked. Freedom tested quickly becomes fear. No sooner had the songs of the sea faded than the complaints began. 3 days into the desert of Shur, the people found no water. When they reached a spring at Marah, its waters were bitter. The same mouths that had sung of divine triumph now cried out against Moses. He prayed, and God showed him a piece of wood. When cast into the water, it turned sweet. The episode revealed the pattern that would repeat through the next 40 years. Need, complaint, intercession, provision, and lesson. From Marah, they moved to Elim, where 12 springs and 70 palm trees offered respite. But comfort in the desert is temporary. Soon hunger set in, and the murmuring returned. Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full. Nostalgia for bondage proved stronger than gratitude for freedom. In response, God promised bread from heaven. At dawn, a fine, flake-like substance appeared on the ground. The people called it manna, from the question manho. What is it? They were instructed to gather only enough for each day, except on the 6th, when they were to collect double, for the 7th day was rest. Those who hoarded found the excess spoiled, those who trusted found sufficiency. The lesson was both practical and spiritual. Dependence is the daily rhythm of faith. Quail also descended at evening, providing meat. The wilderness thus became a paradox, a place of scarcity that revealed abundance. The people's sustenance no longer came from stored grain or predictable seasons, but from immediate grace. Every morning they woke to find faith literally underfoot. Their journey led next to Rephidim, where again there was no water. The people quarreled with Moses, accusing him of leading them out to die. He struck a rock with his staff as commanded, and water poured forth. The place was named Massah and Meribah, testing and quarrelling. These names became warnings in Israel's later Kefridish memory. Do not harden your hearts as at Meribah. It was here too that the first open battle occurred. The Amalekites attacked the rear of the camp. Joshua led the defense while Moses stood on a nearby hill with the staff of God raised. When his hands grew weary, Aaron and Hur held them up. And as long as the staff was lifted, Israel prevailed. The scene fused prayer and action, divine power and human endurance operating together. After the victory, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, visited the camp. He observed the endless line of people waiting for judgment and advised Moses to appoint capable men as chiefs over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Leadership multiplied became sustainable. The suggestion was accepted, and a primitive judiciary was born. Jethro's counsel revealed wisdom that crossed cultural lines. Truth, it seemed, was not the monopoly of one nation. Soon after, the column of cloud and fire led them to the foot of a mountain that loomed like a shadow on the horizon. Sinai. Here, the journey shifted from survival to revelation. The God who had shattered Egypt would now shape a people. The wilderness that tested their bodies would now train their souls. At Sinai's base, tents clustered in orderly rows. Thunder rolled from the summit, and lightning flashed through cloud. The people trembled. Moses ascended into the thick darkness where God was. From that summit came the words that would define not only Israel, but civilization itself, the 10 Commandments. The Commandments began not with law, but with memory. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Every moral demand rested upon relationship. The first 4 defined loyalty to God, no other gods, no idols, reverence for his name, and the sanctity of rest. The remaining 6 defined relationships among people: honor for parents, respect for life, fidelity in marriage, integrity in property and speech, and restraint of desire. These were not arbitrary decrees, they were a charter for freedom. A nation rescued from tyranny was being taught how not to become tyrants themselves. The commandments turned liberation into order, balancing divine authority with human responsibility. They were spoken amid thunder to emphasize gravity, yet written on stone to signify permanence. When the people saw the mountain smoking and heard the trumpet sound, they begged that no further voice come directly to them. Fear had replaced awe. Moses became their mediator, ascending and descending, carrying words between heaven and earth. The laws that followed, covering justice, property, festivals, and compassion, built upon the moral foundation of the commandments. They formed a covenant, a binding relationship, sealed in blood. Young men offered sacrifices, and Moses took half the blood and threw it against the altar, half upon the people, declaring, "Behold the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you." Afterward, Moses, Aaron, and the elders ascended partway up the mountain and saw the God of Israel, beneath whose feet was something like a pavement of sapphire, clear as the sky. They ate and drank in his presence, a moment of intimacy rare in ancient religion. The divine was not distant, it invited fellowship. Moses was then called higher into the cloud for 40 days and nights. There he received detailed instructions for the tabernacle, the portable sanctuary that would accompany Israel through its wanderings. The design was intricate, an ark of acacia wood overlaid with gold, a lampstand, altars, priestly garments, all patterned, God said, after the heavenly reality. Worship would be structured, not improvised, reminding the people daily of holiness. Down below, however, time and fear conspired against faith. As the days passed, the people grew restless. As for this Moses, they said, we do not know what has become of him. They urged Aaron to make them gods to go before them. Aaron gathered their gold earrings and fashioned a calf. The image likely reflected the Egyptian symbol of strength and fertility, yet the people proclaimed it as the God who brought us out of Egypt. This was not a rejection of God in favor of another, but a corruption, a desire for something visible and manageable. Worship turned into revelry. On the mountain, God told Moses, "Go down, for your people have corrupted themselves." When Moses descended and saw the dancing around the calf, he shattered the tablets of stone. His anger burned as fiercely as the mountain's fire. He ground the idol to powder, scattered it on water, and made the people drink it. A physical act of judgment meant to show the emptiness of their sin. Those who refused repentance were struck down by the sword of the Levites. Afterward, Moses returned to the summit to plead, "If you will forgive their sin, but if not, blot me out of your book." It was the cry of a leader willing to stand in the gap. God answered with both mercy and consequence. The covenant would continue, but the generations' journey would be long and painful. Through these wilderness years, Israel learned what freedom demanded: faith under pressure, obedience without sight, and trust in provision they could not control. Manna fell daily, Water flowed when needed, but disbelief never fully died. The people who had seen the sea divide would still ask, "Is the Lord among us or not?" Yet the answer, visible in cloud and flame, never changed. The same presence that had burned in a bush and thundered on Sinai walked with them through the desert, guiding them step by step. Section 7. Rebellion, Idolatry, and Renewal. The mountain that had once blazed with glory now loomed in silence. Smoke drifted from its slopes, the smell of burnt offerings mingling with dust and sweat. Around its base lay a people learning what it means to live in covenant with a God who is unseen, yet unmistakably near. They had heard his voice in thunder, seen his fire, eaten bread from heaven, yet the lessons of faith are slow to take root in hearts trained by fear. The wilderness of Sinai became a vast classroom of obedience. Each dawn brought manna, each night the flicker of divine fire. The days were measured by ritual, the camp ordered by tribe, and the people governed by the law given through Moses. The tabernacle, the dwelling place of God among his people, was under construction, its details precise and reverent. Bezalel and Oholiab, craftsmen filled with the spirit of wisdom, worked gold and acacia wood into sacred form. The nation was being shaped not only by commandments, but by craft, discipline, and sacred rhythm. Yet even amid structure, rebellion brewed. Freedom is never an easy tutor. Some longed for the old predictability of Egypt's bondage, for its onions and bread and known routines. Others resented the authority of Moses and Aaron, forgetting the miracles that had made them possible. The wilderness, in its monotony, became the stage for discontent. The golden calf, a return to the visible. The most infamous act of rebellion came while Moses communed with God upon Sinai for 40 days and nights. Below, impatience spread like fire through dry reeds. "As for this Moses," they said, "we do not know what has become of him." The people's fear disguised itself as practicality. They demanded an image, a visible token of divine presence they could touch and carry. Aaron, yielding to pressure, gathered their gold and shaped it into a calf. Whether inspired by Egyptian symbolism or ancient Semitic cult practice, the golden calf represented a compromise, the worship of the true God through forbidden form. Aaron proclaimed, "Tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord," using the very covenant name revealed at the burning bush. The people rose early, sacrificed, ate, drank, and rose up to play, a phrase suggesting revelry and moral abandon. In one stroke they had shattered the commandment against idols. On the mountain, God interrupted his instructions to Moses, "Go down, for your people, whom you brought out of Egypt, have corrupted themselves." The divine tone shifted from affection to grievance. The covenant, only recently sealed in blood, was already broken. Moses descended carrying the tablets of the law, stone written by the finger of God. When he saw the calf and the dancing, fury overtook him. The tablets crashed to the ground, shattering at the mountain's foot. The act was both literal and symbolic. The covenant itself lay in pieces. Moses burned the calf, ground it to powder, scattered it on the water, and made the people drink it, a gesture forcing them to taste the bitterness of their betrayal. When he confronted Aaron, the elder brother stumbled for excuses. "I threw the gold into the fire, and out came this calf." The absurdity of his defense underscored the corruption of fear. Moses called for those still, loyal to God, and the sons of Levi stepped forward. That day, violence purged the camp. 3,000 perished. The price of idolatry was written in blood, Moses as intercessor. Yet even in wrath, mercy stirred. The next day, Moses returned up the mountain to plead. "Perhaps I can make atonement for your sin," he said. His prayer was both bold and broken. "If you will forgive their sin, but if not, blot me out of your book." He offered his life for theirs, a foreshadowing of all future mediators who would stand between guilt and judgment. God answered with tempered justice. The people would continue toward the promised land, but divine companionship would now be conditional. "I will send an angel before you," God said, "but I will not go up among you, lest I consume you on the way." The people mourned this pronouncement. Their ornaments, symbols of pride and festivity, were removed, and the camp grew somber. Moses, unwilling to accept partial presence, pitched a tent outside the camp where he met with God face to face as a man speaks to his friend. This intimacy marked Moses uniquely among prophets. In that tent he prayed words that would define leadership for all time. "If your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here." The plea was simple. Without God's companionship, deliverance loses its meaning. The answer came with grace. "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." Then Moses asked for the impossible. "Show me your glory." God consented in part, placing Moses in a cleft of rock and covering him with his hand as his presence passed by. Moses saw only God's back, a metaphor for partial revelation, but heard the name anew. The Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. This self-description of divine character would echo through centuries of worship and prophecy. Renewal of the covenant. At God's command, Moses cut new tablets and ascended once more. For 40 days he neither ate nor drank. The covenant was renewed with reiterated laws and a command to guard the Sabbath, a sign of sanctified time. When Moses descended this time, his face shone with reflected glory. The radiance frightened the people. He veiled himself when speaking to them, removing the veil only in God's presence. The symbol was clear. Human beings cannot behold divine glory directly, yet those who commune with it carry its reflection. The tabernacle's construction soon resumed in earnest. Every material, gold, silver, bronze, blue, and scarlet thread, was contributed freely. Former slaves, once compelled to build monuments for Pharaoh, now gave willingly to build a dwelling for their true king. The ark, altars, lampstand, and priestly garments took shape, each detail echoing heavenly pattern. When all was finished, the cloud that had guided them descended upon the tabernacle, filling it with luminous weight. From that day forward, the cloud's movement determined the camps. When it lifted, they journeyed. When it rested, they remained. Lessons of rebellion. The golden calf episode was more than an isolated failure. It revealed a deep human instinct, the longing for gods that can be seen, for religion without responsibility. The people wanted a deity to bless their desires, not transform them. Yet, even in their faithlessness, God's faithfulness persisted. The covenant was broken but mended, fractured but reforged. Grace was not a modern invention. It was already alive in Sinai's shadow. Through this cycle of sin, intercession, and renewal, Moses grew from reluctant messenger to seasoned mediator. The man who once doubted his voice now conversed with God as friend with friend. He learned that leadership meant bearing the weight of others' failures as if they were his own. The people learned that holiness could not be domesticated, and that divine mercy, though infinite, demanded loyalty in return. In the pattern of rebellion and restoration lay a larger story, the rhythm of all covenant life. Humanity forgets, God remembers. Humanity strays, God calls back. Humanity breaks, God repairs. The wilderness became not merely a route to Canaan, but a mirror in which the human heart saw itself clearly for the first time. As months passed, the camp began to move again. Trumpets sounded, the tribes assembled by banners, and the ark was lifted. Moses' prayer echoed through the desert wind. "Rise up, O Lord, and let your enemies be scattered, and when you rest, return, O Lord, to the 10,000 thousands of Israel." The covenant was intact, the journey resumed, and the presence moved with them, fire by night, cloud by day, unrelenting, unforgotten. Section 8. 40 Years in the Wilderness. No map could capture the shape of 40 years. The wilderness wandered as much as the people did. Their route twisted between mountains and wadis, looping where fear overruled faith. Each campsite bore a name, each name a story: Massa, Meribah, Taberah, Kibroth Hattaavah. The desert became a geography of lessons written in sand and wind. The early days of the march were hopeful. The newly built tabernacle glowed at the camp center like a heartbeat. The tribes, arrayed around it in symmetry, moved when the cloud lifted and rested when it settled. But order in formation did not mean order in heart. The murmuring that began at Sinai continued like a refrain. The craving for Egypt. At Kibroth Hattaavah, the graves of craving, the people lamented the monotony of manna. Who will give us meat to eat? We remember the fish we ate in Egypt freely. Nostalgia can turn even slavery into memory's paradise. In answer, God sent quail in abundance, but also judgment. Those who gorged themselves died before digesting the gift. The lesson was sharp. Appetite without gratitude becomes self-destruction. Not long after, even leadership fractured. Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses, questioning his unique authority. Has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Jealousy disguised itself as equality. God's response was unambiguous. He summoned all three to the tent of meeting, descended in cloud, and declared that Moses was faithful in all his house, spoken to face, not in riddles. Miriam was struck with leprosy, her skin white as snow. At Aaron's plea, Moses interceded again, and she was healed after 7 days outside the camp. The prophet who had sung deliverance learned humility through isolation. The spies and the lost generation. From the wilderness of Paran, 12 men were chosen, one from each tribe, to scout the land of Canaan. They returned after 40 days carrying a cluster of grapes so large it took 2 men to bear it on a pole. It is a land flowing with milk and honey, they reported, but the people are giants, and the cities are fortified. 10 voices spoke fear. 2, Joshua and Caleb, spoke faith. If the Lord delights in us, he will bring us in. Fear triumphed. The people cried, "Let us choose a leader and return to Egypt." At that cry, hope collapsed. God's verdict was devastating. This generation would not enter the land. Their children would inherit the promise, but they themselves would wander until every doubting heart was buried beneath the sand. The 40 days of spying became 40 years of delay, a day for each failure of faith. The people mourned too late. Some attempted to enter the land by force, ignoring the warning that God's presence was not with them. They were rooted and driven back. Presumption proved as deadly as disbelief. The long march. The years that followed blurred into repetition. Camp, move, hunger, thirst, complaint, mercy. Yet, amid monotony, transformation took place. Children born in the wilderness grew up knowing no Egypt. Their first memories were of manna, their songs were of deliverance, their laws were daily life. The desert stripped away nostalgia and trained endurance. Miracles continued quietly. Clothes and sandals did not wear out. Water flowed again from the rock at Kadesh, though at a cost. When commanded to speak to the rock, Moses struck it twice in anger. Water gushed out, but the act cost him entry into the promised land. The reason, God said, was that he had not sanctified me in the eyes of the people. Even the greatest leader was not above the law he taught. At Mount Hor, Aaron's priestly garments were transferred to his son Eleazar before the eyes of the congregation. The old priest died, and the people mourned 30 days. Miriam too passed away, her death marking the fading of the first generation. Moses remained as the last of the founders, aged but unbroken. Fiery serpents and bronze healing. When impatience flared again, the people spoke against God and Moses. Venomous snakes invaded the camp, their bites lethal. At Moses' intercession, God instructed him to fashion a bronze serpent and set it on a pole. Whoever looked upon it lived. The image was paradoxical. The symbol of their suffering became the instrument of healing. Centuries later, this emblem would be recalled as a metaphor for salvation through faith, life drawn from the very sign of judgment. Victories in the east. As the years waned, Israel approached the territories east of the Jordan. King Sihon of Heshbon and Og of Bashan opposed them and were defeated. The victories signaled a new phase. The generation raised in wilderness, proving itself capable of conquest. 2.5 tribes, Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh, chose to settle these lands, promising to aid their brethren across the river before returning to their herds. The lessons of the years. 40 years in the wilderness were not wasted. They turned slaves into soldiers, wanderers into worshippers. The tabernacle, always at the center, reminded them that holiness travels. The presence is not confined to place but to obedience. The manna taught trust, the law taught justice, the failures taught humility. By the time they reached Moab's plains opposite Jericho, the people were unrecognizable from those who had left Egypt. Their story had become identity. Their trials had become testimony. At the journey's end, Moses stood on the ridge of Nebo and looked westward. The land spread before him, green beyond the Jordan. He knew he would not cross, yet his heart rested. The seed he had planted had grown. The promise he had announced was within sight. The wilderness had done its work. Section 9. The Final March. Moab and the Edge of the Promised Land. The wilderness was almost behind them. After 40 years of wandering, the camp spread across the plains of Moab, overlooking the valley of the Jordan River. Beyond that narrow ribbon of water rose the hills of Canaan, shimmering in the heat, a horizon that looked like hope itself. The people had arrived at the threshold of promise, yet between them and the fulfillment of generations stood final tests of loyalty and leadership. A new generation on the march. The old generation was gone, its bones resting under desert sands. The new generation, born beneath the open sky, had no memory of Egypt's bricks or chains. They were children of the manna, a people who had learned to wake each morning expecting the miraculous. Under their feet the land was still harsh, but their hearts were hardened in endurance. The journey north had brought both conflict and victory. When the king of Edom refused passage through his territory, the Israelites turned away, unwilling to provoke their kin. When the kings of Sihon and Og barred their way, they fought and won, seizing lands east of the Jordan. These victories were small glimpses of what lay ahead, a confirmation that divine promise was not myth but unfolding fact. The plains of Moab became the staging ground for transition. Tents stretched as far as the eyes could see, organized by tribes, the tabernacle gleaming at the center. For the first time, the land before them was not endless desert but cultivated soil. Freedom, once abstract, was now tangible enough to see and smell, the fragrance of palms, vines, and grain carried on the wind. The snare of Peor. At this final station, danger came not from armies, but from indulgence. The people camped near Baal Peor, a Moabite shrine notorious for fertility rites. Many Israelites mingled with Moabite women, joining in their feasts and sacrifices. The text says they yoked themselves to Baal of Peor, meaning they entered into ritual allegiance with a foreign god. The punishment was swift. A plague swept the camp until Phinehas, grandson of Aaron, halted it through an act of zealous judgment. 24,000 perished. The episode underscored an ancient truth. External enemies may threaten the body, but internal compromise corrodes the soul. Idolatry had already nearly destroyed them at Sinai. Here, on the very edge of fulfillment, it nearly did again. The renewal that followed required cleansing of both spirit and community. The prophet from the east. It was in Moab, too, that an unusual drama unfolded, one in which Israel was not the speaker, but the subject. Balak, the Moabite king, alarmed by Israel's victories, sought supernatural aid. He summoned Balaam, a renowned seer from the region of Mesopotamia, to curse Israel. The story of Balaam is complex, blending politics and prophecy. When Balak's messengers arrived, Balaam sought divine permission to accompany them. At first he was forbidden. Later he was allowed to go, but warned to speak only what God commanded. On his journey, an angel blocked his path, seen not by Balaam, but by his donkey. 3 times the animal turned aside, and 3 times Balaam struck her. At last the donkey spoke, rebuking him. Then Balaam's eyes were opened, and he saw the angel with drawn sword. The scene, part parable and part rebuke, reversed expectations. A beast perceived what the prophet missed. On the heights overlooking Israel's camp, Balak prepared altars for the curse, but each time Balaam opened his mouth, blessing poured out instead. "How shall I curse whom God has not cursed?" he said. "Behold, the people shall dwell alone and shall not be counted among the nations." His words, meant as malediction, became benediction. A later oracle reached deeper. "I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel." The prophecy pointed beyond the moment, hinting at a future ruler whose reign would extend far beyond Canaan. Whether Balaam fully grasped his words is uncertain. Prophecy often transcends its speaker. What matters is that even an outsider, hired to curse, became an instrument of blessing. Yet irony shadowed the event. Though Balaam could not curse Israel directly, later tradition holds that he advised Balak to ensnare them through seduction, the very sin of Peor that followed, the weapon he could not wield through words he employed through temptation. Thus the seer who blessed became complicit in downfall, a reminder that spiritual gifts do not guarantee moral wisdom. The second census and new leadership. In the aftermath, God commanded a new census, the second since leaving Egypt. The count confirmed both loss and renewal. None from the first generation remained except Joshua and Caleb, the faithful spies. The land would indeed belong to their descendants, but conquest would be led by new hands. The matter of inheritance also surfaced. The daughters of Zelophehad, whose father had died without sons, approached Moses to ask for their family's portion. Their appeal, gracious yet bold, introduced a new principle of justice, that daughters could inherit when no sons remained. It was a small legal change, but revolutionary for its time, demonstrating that the law of God bent toward equity. Soon after, the time came for transition of leadership. On Mount Abarim, God told Moses, "Go up and see the land that I have given to the children of Israel. After you have seen it, you also shall be gathered to your people." Moses, ever the shepherd, thought not of himself, but of those he would leave behind. Let the Lord appoint a man over the congregation. God chose Joshua son of Nun, a man in whom is the Spirit. Moses laid his hands upon him before the assembly, transferring authority through both symbol and spirit. Leadership passed not by bloodline, but by faithfulness. The last instructions. Before the crossing, laws were reiterated. Festivals, sacrifices, vows, and the cities of refuge for those who killed unintentionally. The Levitical priesthood was organized by rotation. Boundaries for tribal allotments were drawn in outline. These details, meticulous and at times repetitive, signaled a shift from wandering to settlement. A people without land had needed miracles. A people with land would need structure. Each tribe was reminded of its duty to the covenant. The priests were given charge of the sanctuary, the Levites of the tabernacle's transport. War against Midian was ordered in retribution for Peor's seduction, and though Balaam himself perished in the battle, the lessons of his deceit lingered. On the banks of promise. At last, the camp settled opposite Jericho, the city of palms. The Jordan flowed before them, narrow yet formidable, its crossing as symbolic as the sea had been. Here Moses delivered his final words, a series of addresses that would later form the book of Deuteronomy. He recounted the journey, the laws, the failures, and the mercies. "Remember," he urged, "how the Lord led you these 40 years in the wilderness to humble you and to test you." His speech blended history and prophecy, memory and warning. The theme was covenant loyalty. Prosperity would follow obedience. Exile would follow apostasy. The people were reminded that freedom was not license but vocation, a calling to be a nation of justice, where the widow, orphan, and stranger would find protection. Moses' tone was paternal, weary but steadfast. He had carried these people through rebellion, plague, and battle. Now he prepared the Kemetz for a future he would not share. The Jordan would open for them as the sea had for their parents, but he would remain behind. Still, his spirit was at peace. Leadership's truest measure is not how far one travels, but how well one prepares others to go farther. The view from Nebo. When all was ready, Moses ascended Mount Nebo to the peak called Pisgah, opposite Jericho. From there, the panorama unfolded like a revelation. He saw the land of Gilead and Dan, the valleys of Ephraim and Manasseh, the plains of Judah stretching to the western sea. The text says that God himself showed him every corner, even the distant Negev. For a moment, time and distance folded, and the promise of centuries stood complete before the eyes of one man. No bitterness clouds the scene. There is awe, acceptance, and quiet fulfillment. The promise given to Abraham, land, people, blessing, had reached its threshold. Moses would not cross, but he would see, and seeing was enough. The narrative says simply, "So Moses the servant of the Lord died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord, and he buried him in the valley in the land of Moab, but no one knows his grave to this day. The phrase, according to the word of the Lord, carries the sense of intimacy. He died as God had spoken, as though death itself were a final conversation between friends. His eyes were undimmed, his vigor unabated. The people wept for 30 days, mourning the prophet who had stood between them and destruction. When the days of mourning ended, Joshua assumed command, and the era of conquest began. The book of Moses closed, but the covenant story moved forward. The legacy in motion, Moses left no monument but a people, no statue but a law, no dynasty but a faith. His leadership had forged a nation from fugitives, his words had carved morality into stone, and his prayers had bridged earth and heaven. When Israel crossed the Jordan, they carried not only weapons and tents, but the memory of a man who had walked with God face to face. In later centuries, prophets would measure themselves against his shadow, poets would call back his songs, and teachers of every generation would trace the shape of justice to his commandments. His death on Nebo did not end his work, it sanctified it. The view he saw became the inheritance of all who seek promise through perseverance. Section 10. The death of Moses and his legacy. The story of Moses does not close with tragedy, but with completion. He had begun life hidden among reeds, drawn out of water by mercy. He ended on a mountain, drawn up by God in friendship. The arc of his life mirrors the arc of Israel, itself: emergence, struggle, covenant, failure, renewal, and rest. His burial remains a mystery. The text's silence about the grave protects against idolatry. The man who condemned the golden calf would not become an object of veneration himself. No one knows his burial place to this day, it says, as if to ensure that memory would preserve his message, not his relics. The book of Deuteronomy ends with a eulogy unparalleled in ancient literature. Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. The phrase face to face recurs because it defines relationship, not privilege. Moses' greatness lay not in miracles or military victories, but in intimacy with God and compassion for his people. The legacy he left is layered. To the Israelites, he was lawgiver and mediator. To later generations, he became the archetype of prophet, teacher, and deliverer. His name would echo through psalms, prophetic scrolls, and the songs of exiles yearning for home. Even in foreign empires, when Israel had no king, the Torah of Moses remained their constitution. Centuries later, in desert monasteries, rabbis and scribes would still debate his words. In faraway synagogues, his story would be read anew each year. And in other faiths, his name would rise again, revered by Christians as lawgiver and forerunner of Christ, by Muslims as Musa, prophet of steadfastness. Few figures have crossed so many boundaries of time, culture, and creed. Historically, the Mosaic era marks the transition from patriarchal family faith to national identity. Under Moses, tribes became a nation bound not by lineage but by law. His covenant transformed faith from private inheritance into public vocation. Morality, once tribal, became universal. The stranger, the widow, and the orphan entered divine concern. His code sanctified compassion and restraint as the true measures of strength. The wilderness years forged a collective soul. The laws written on tablets became customs written on hearts. Festivals ensured remembrance, Passover for deliverance, weeks for provision, tabernacles for journeying. Each feast repeated the story until history became rhythm, and rhythm became faith. Moses' leadership style defied the norms of his age. Ancient rulers claimed divinity. Moses disclaimed even ownership of his own success. "Shall we bring you water out of this rock?" the one time he spoke as though power were his, cost him entrance to Canaan. His humility, not his authority, defined him. Scripture itself testifies, now the man Moses was very meek, more than any man on the face of the earth. Yet meekness did not mean weakness. He faced Pharaoh without armor, pleaded with God without fear, rebuked a nation without apology. His strength lay in alignment, his will braided to a higher one. This union of courage and submission became the pattern for all true leadership afterward. Standing on Nebo, he saw not only land, but legacy. Across the valley stretched vineyards, villages, and the faint shimmer of Jericho's walls. Behind him stretched graves of wanderers, each mound a testament to both judgment and mercy. Beneath his feet lay the soil of Moab, before him the fulfillment of promise. Between those worlds stood one man and his God. The scene, quiet and complete, has moved readers for millennia. Some imagine a final conversation, the man who once argued with the divine now falling silent in peace. Others picture the angel of death approaching gently, for Jewish tradition says Moses did not die by sickness or violence, but by a divine kiss, his soul gathered as a friend's breath. Whether literal or poetic, the image conveys tenderness. The life that began in rescue ends in rest. When Israel mourned, it was not merely for a leader, but for the presence that had guided them through terror and transformation. Joshua's first command was to rise and cross the Jordan. Grief was allowed, but paralysis was not. The covenant had outlived its first keeper, as it was meant to. God's work does not die with his servants. In the centuries that followed, Moses' story became a mirror for all who sought deliverance. Every captivity found its metaphor in Egypt, every liberation its echo in the Exodus. Wherever oppression demanded courage, someone remembered the staff, the plagues, the sea, and the song. The story became more than Israel's history. It became humanity's hope. Moses' legacy also endures in law and conscience. Modern legal systems, ethical codes, and even the concept of human dignity trace invisible lines back to Sinai. The commandments, simple, balanced, enduring, remain the architecture of moral civilization. They link duty to reverence, freedom to restraint, and justice to compassion. They remind humanity that liberty without holiness becomes chaos. The story of Moses ends with his death, but his voice never ceased. Each reading of the Torah begins with his words, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying." His dialogue with the divine continues in every generation that reads, studies, and wrestles with what righteousness demands. The burning bush still burns in the mind of anyone who asks what holiness requires in an unholy world. Section 11. Archaeological, historical, and symbolic interpretations. When the desert winds finally covered the footprints of Israel's wanderings, history and memory began their long dialogue. The story of Moses, part miracle, part movement, has survived not only as sacred text, but as an object of study, awe, and argument. Archaeologists, historians, and theologians have all tried to locate this journey in time and terrain, searching for traces of a people who walked between empire and eternity. The historical question of the Exodus. The Bible presents the Exodus as the defining event of Israel's birth, yet it offers few chronological markers by which modern historians can fix its date. Egyptian records, from the period, painstakingly catalogued in stone and papyrus, are silent on the mass departure of slaves. That silence has led some scholars to skepticism, yet the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Ancient empires rarely recorded their own defeats, and the Hebrews at that stage were not a literate power chronicling their own saga. Two broad timeframes dominate discussion. The first places the Exodus in the 15th century BCE, during the reign of Thutmose III or Amenhotep II, roughly aligning with the biblical calculation of 480 years before Solomon's Temple. The second situates it in the 13th century BCE under Ramesses II, based on the mention of the store city Ramses in Exodus. Each model carries strengths and difficulties. The earlier offers internal consistency with later genealogies. The later fits known settlement patterns in Canaan and Egypt's geopolitical reach. Archaeological surveys across the Sinai have yet to uncover definitive evidence of a mass migration, but the desert is a poor archivist. Wind and time erase the traces of nomads swiftly. What archaeology does confirm is the presence of Semitic populations in Egypt during the Late Bronze Age, workers, servants, and even soldiers integrated into the empire's labor systems. Ostraka and papyri mention Semitic names among quarry and construction crews. A people like the Hebrews could easily have lived within Egypt's vast bureaucracy of bondage. In the highlands of Canaan, around the same centuries, excavations show the sudden appearance of small unwalled settlements, simple stone houses, communal courtyards, and distinct pottery styles. Scholars describe it as an ethnic explosion of a pastoral population entering sedentary life. Whether these were returning Hebrews or indigenous Canaanites embracing new identity, the pattern aligns with a cultural memory of migration and settlement. History, in its own way, whispers confirmation through silence and shape. The route of the journey. The path from Egypt to Canaan crosses one of the world's most studied landscapes, yet the exact route of the Exodus remains uncertain. The text's references to the Sea of Reed, traditionally rendered Red Sea, point to Egypt's eastern marshlands rather than the deep gulf known today. The Hebrew Yam Suf literally means Sea of Reeds, suggesting a chain of shallow lakes along the ancient delta. Changes in geography, caused by millennia of silt and shifting watercourses, make precise mapping impossible. Some propose a northern route along the Mediterranean coast, others a central path through Sinai's desert heart, and others still a southern route near the Gulf of Suez. Each hypothesis matches parts of the biblical itinerary, but not all. The wilderness of Sin, the oases of Elim and Rephidim, and Mount Sinai itself have been associated with numerous sites, from Jebel Musa in the Sinai Peninsula to Jebel al-Lawz in northwestern Arabia. The debate is unlikely to resolve. The geography of Revelation may have been intentionally left fluid, reminding later generations that the sacred cannot be reduced to coordinates. Egyptian parallels and context. The Exodus story, though unique in theology, resonates with Egyptian motifs familiar to ancient audiences. The infant Moses drawn from water recalls earlier Egyptian legends of divinely chosen children rescued from peril. His name, derived from the Egyptian root emps, born of, fits the linguistic pattern of royal titles like Thutmose, born of Thoth. The plagues too mirror Egypt's ecological rhythms, river turning red with algae, frogs and insects following, livestock diseases and sandstorms darkening the sky. To ancient listeners, the sequence would have dramatized nature itself revolting against empire. Historically, Egypt's economy depended on forced labor for monumental projects. Papyrus records speak of Asiatics conscripted to make bricks, and ancient tomb paintings depict overseers with rods supervising workers under scorching sun. The biblical image of Hebrew slaves, therefore, stands not as fantasy but as representation of a known social reality. What the Exodus adds is moral revolution, that the God of slaves, not kings, is the true ruler of history. The covenant as civilization. Even apart from questions of geography and chronology, the Mosaic covenant marks a watershed in human development. Law in the ancient Near East often served royal authority. The Code of Hammurabi, centuries earlier, began with the king receiving statutes from the gods to impose order. Moses' law differs radically. It presents divine law given directly to the people through a mediator, binding ruler and subject alike. The standard of justice became transcendent, not political. The Ten Commandments, terse and balanced, function as the foundation of moral consciousness across cultures. They unite inward motive with outward behavior, acknowledging both divine sovereignty and human dignity. They introduced a rhythm of rest into societies driven by labor, established limits on power, and sanctified compassion as obligation. In this, the Mosaic law outlived empires, shaping ethical thought far beyond the reach of the ancient desert. Moses in comparative tradition. Outside the Hebrew scriptures, Moses appears in a mosaic of traditions. Egyptian historian Manetho, writing in the 3rd century BCE, recounted a distorted version of the Exodus in which lepers were expelled from Egypt under a priest named Osaseph, later identified with Moses. Greek writers like Strabo and Artapanus portrayed him as philosopher and legislator. In these reimaginings, historical memory mingled with admiration and misunderstanding. Even adversaries could not erase his stature. In later Jewish thought, Moses became the archetype of the perfect prophet, one who beheld God's form yet remained mortal. Rabbinic writings expanded on his patience, humility, and intercession. In Christian interpretation, he was seen as a type of Christ, deliverer, lawgiver, and mediator of a new covenant. In Islam, he became Musa, the prophet who confronted Pharaoh, received the law, and led his people toward guidance. The Quran recounts his story more than that of any other prophet, emphasizing perseverance and divine mercy. Across faiths, Moses stands as a bridge between law and grace, justice and compassion. Symbolism of the journey beyond history and creed, the Exodus endures as an existential map of the human condition. Egypt represents bondage, not merely political but spiritual, addiction, fear, injustice, the systems that crush the image of God in humanity. The wilderness represents transformation, the in-between space where certainty dies and faith is born. The Promised Land symbolizes purpose realized not through comfort, but through covenant. Every generation reenacts this pattern. Nations struggling for freedom see their story in it. Individuals wrestling with despair or renewal trace their own exodus through its lines. The waters that divide and close, the manna that falls each dawn, the law written on stone, all become metaphors of inner journey. The story's universality explains its endurance, archaeological echoes and enduring mysteries. Though definitive artifacts of Moses' passage elude discovery, scattered hints keep the discussion alive. Inscriptions from Egyptian outposts along Sinai record fluctuations in slave labor populations. Late Bronze Age pottery found in oases aligns roughly with biblical encampments, yet archaeology by its nature speaks in fragments. The Bible, by contrast, speaks in meaning. The two do not always converge, but when they do, they illuminate each other. Perhaps the most significant evidence lies not in sand, but in survival. A people small among nations endured exile, invasion and dispersion, yet still tell this story at every Passover. Cultures far greater left ruins. Israel left testimony. That continuity itself may be the most persuasive artifact of all. The historical Moses, did Moses himself exist as described? Most scholars, even cautious ones, affirm a historical core, a charismatic leader, Semitic by origin yet educated in Egyptian culture, could plausibly have emerged in the late Bronze Age to lead a tribal exodus. His memory, preserved through oral tradition and ritual, grew into the composite figure we know. Yet even if stripped to barest history, his achievement remains singular, the transformation of oppressed tribes into a people defined by faith, ethics, and hope. In that sense, Moses' existence is not only historical but civilizational. His influence transcends the boundaries of archaeology, inscribed instead on conscience. Where tablets of stone have eroded, his commandments still govern minds. The meaning beneath the sand. Modern skepticism often demands proof before wonder, but the Exodus was never meant to satisfy curiosity. It was meant to awaken conscience. Its truth lies less in the precision of dates than in the persistence of its message. That power is accountable, that freedom requires discipline, and that divine purpose moves through history's least expected instruments. The mountain remains unnamed, the path unmarked, the grave unknown, perhaps by divine design. For if the story could be confined to one desert or one tomb, it might have stayed there. Instead, its very elusiveness has made it universal. The wilderness that swallowed the evidence preserved the meaning. Section 12, The Eternal Journey, Moses' Legacy in Human Consciousness. Long after the last campfire of the Exodus faded, the journey of Moses continued, not across deserts but through minds. His footsteps echo wherever law confronts injustice, wherever a voice insists that human dignity is sacred. The man who once stood before Pharaoh now stands before every tyrant in memory, the journey as archetype. Every age has its Egypt and its wilderness. The pattern Moses embodied, deliverance, testing, covenant and promise, repeats in personal and collective histories alike. For the enslaved, he is the herald of freedom. For the wanderer, the companion of endurance. For the believer, the bridge between human frailty and divine faithfulness. In medieval synagogues, the story of the Exodus became the pulse of identity. In Christian cathedrals, Moses appeared in stained glass beside the prophets, holding tablets of stone that symbolized moral law. In Islamic tradition, his dialogue with God on Sinai became the model of prophecy, direct, fearless, intimate. And in modern movements for justice, his cry, "Let my people go," found new voice in every language of liberation. The African-American spirituals of the 19th century turned his name into a password of hope. In marches for civil rights, preachers quoted him at the edges of oppression. "I have been to the mountaintop, and I have seen the promised land." The words of Martin Luther King Jr. deliberately echoed Moses' final vision on Nebo. The prophet's journey had become the map of moral progress itself. The symbol of the mountain, Mount Sinai, and Mount Nebo frame Moses' life. The first, a place of revelation, the second of rest. Together they symbolize the paradox of faith, that the promised fulfillment is often seen but not fully entered. Leaders, dreamers, and reformers have recognized this pattern in their own unfinished labors. The mountain is not failure, it is horizon. To glimpse the future one will not personally inhabit is the cost of all true service. The law and the heart. Centuries after Moses, prophets like Jeremiah and Ezekiel spoke of a day when the law would be written not on stone, but on hearts. Yet that promise does not abolish Moses, it completes him. The external tablets become internal conscience. The visible covenant becomes invisible conviction. Every ethical awakening, whether in religion, philosophy, or human rights, traces its ancestry to Sinai's thunder. The commandment's simplicity is their immortality. They do not age, they unfold. "You shall not murder" expands into the defense of all life. "You shall not bear false witness" becomes the foundation of truth itself. The Sabbath command, once about rest, becomes a call to dignity amid ceaseless productivity. Even those who deny revelation still live within its moral grammar. Moses in art, literature, and thought from antiquity to modernity, artists have sought to capture his magnitude. Michelangelo carved him in marble, horns of light crowning his head, an artistic misreading of the Hebrew word for radiant, yet symbolically apt, enlightenment mistaken for power. Painters of every century portrayed him on Sinai, veiled in glory, the tablets gleaming like dawn. Writers, too, found in him inexhaustible metaphor. Philo of Alexandria saw him as the model of divine reason. Dante called him the great captain of the faithful. Goethe admired his courage to confront both heaven and earth. In philosophy, Moses represents the tension between order and inspiration, between law that stabilizes and spirit that transforms. Even in secular literature, his story persists. Modern retellings, from novels to films, reimagine him as rebel, mystic, or liberator, depending on the age's need. Yet, through every interpretation, the essence remains: a man who met the infinite and returned not with mystery alone, but with moral clarity. The psychology of the wilderness. The wilderness, beyond geography, has become a metaphor for every human transition. It is the space between bondage and belonging, where old certainties die and new identities are born. In this sense, every generation passes through its own Sinai, learning to trust what it cannot see. For individuals, the wilderness might be illness, exile, doubt, or change. For nations, it may be crisis or renewal. What Moses' story teaches is that wilderness is not abandonment. It is apprenticeship. The silence between miracles is the workshop of faith. The timeless teacher. Moses' enduring power lies in his humanity. He stammered, doubted, grew angry, and grieved. Yet through every weakness he persisted. His imperfections make him accessible. His perseverance makes him exemplary. He reminds humanity that greatness is not perfection but fidelity, remaining at one's post even when the task exceeds strength. The God he served did not choose him for eloquence or pedigree, but for willingness. That truth still comforts anyone who feels inadequate to their calling. The burning bush burns still in every conscience that hears a voice saying, "I will be with you." The modern echo. In today's world, technological, restless, skeptical, the story of Moses continues to ask uncomfortable questions. What does freedom mean without virtue? Can law survive without reverence? Can power exist without humility? The narrative insists that liberation without covenant collapses into chaos. It offers no easy answers but an enduring framework. Freedom sustained by faith, justice tempered by mercy, and leadership bound by accountability to the divine. The unmarked grave and the unending story. That no one knows where Moses is buried is itself a final teaching. The absence of a shrine prevents the confinement of his message. His legacy was never meant to dwell in stone. It was meant to move with people. Each Passover table, each reading of the law, each act of justice becomes his monument. When the Torah concludes with his death, it immediately opens to new life. Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands on him. The continuity is deliberate. Divine purpose does not die with human instruments. Every generation is handed the staff and told to cross its own river. The eternal journey. The journey of Moses ends where all human journeys begin, in the longing for communion with what is greater than ourselves. His life, drawn from water, forged in wilderness, crowned on a mountain, encapsulates the pilgrimage of the soul from fear to faith, from slavery to service, from question to quiet understanding. And so his story lives on, retold not just as history but as hope. Every conscience that resists tyranny, every heart that seeks justice, every voice that defends the oppressed walks in his shadow. The Promised Land remains both destination and symbol, a world made whole through obedience to the highest law. In the end, Moses' true miracle was not the parting of seas, but the awakening of moral vision. Empires rise and fall, but the command to love justice, walk humbly, and remember deliverance endures. The bush still burns, the voice still calls, and humanity, wandering though it may be, still follows the fire by night and the cloud by day.